Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 22nd, 2022. Today I'm going to take a look at what is behind the war drive in the West, why it is that the West is telling Zelensky in Ukraine to keep fighting, and they're using this to carry out a sanctions regime against Russia aimed at destroying the Russian economy. This is a long planned intention of Western countries, in particular directed by the City of London and Wall Street, and the imposition of a war economy on the world, including on the transatlantic region, will in the end kill more people than what the military operations going on in Ukraine right now. Now, this is not generally being reported. And there's a good reason for it. Not only is it that they don't want you to know what's behind the war, but they don't want you to know what the economic reality is. The fact that we're now moving into a post-industrial rubbish heap in the West, in which the governments are being put under central bank dictatorship, not only on credit and currency policy, but on spending policy. And that the intention is what they now call demand destruction, which is an austerity policy that will end up, as I said, taking more lives than the war that is underway in Ukraine. This is something that affects everyone, and it's based on collapsing the physical economy, shutting down industry, shutting down science and technology, especially related to energy production. So the effects of this on your life are not caused by what Putin is doing, but by a 50-year transition away from the physical economic policies characterized by the American system into a neoliberal speculative economy, which benefits handfuls of billionaires at the expense of the vast, vast majority of the world's population. This was put into high gear after August 15, 1971, when synarchist George Shultz and his colleague Paul Volcker convinced Richard Nixon to remove the dollar from the gold standard and a gold reserve system and to allow a floating exchange rate. This, over the next couple of years, was combined with free trade policies, deregulation, privatization, which is really what we mean by globalization today, and IMF, International Monetary Fund, conditionalities against the developing sector. There is a credit shift away from investment into research and development, into physical goods production, away from infrastructure. And most of the funds started shifting toward quick buck speculation. This created bubbles. And we were told the bubbles are signs of economic growth and economic health. And they seem to be until they popped, as bubbles always pop. Now, Lyndon LaRouche intervened repeatedly into this process. He warned before the August 15, 1971 decision by Nixon that something was coming and this was going to be a disaster. After it happened, he correctly forecast that the people who made this shift away from the Bretton Woods system were going toward Schachtian economic policies, characterized by or modeled on the policies of Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's finance minister, who was put in place by the City of London and Wall Street, specifically to build a war economy in Germany while killing off large sections of the German population and eventually the population in Europe as a whole. Now, in the mid-1970s, LaRouche intervened with a specific proposal called the International Development Bank, and shortly after that with a proposal for the European Monetary Fund, which were based on shifting back toward Bretton Woods-style fixed exchange rate system based on investment in science and technology, combined with debt reorganization, moratorium cancellation, and so on. Instead, what was imposed under Carter was called controlled disintegration, and we've been living under one form or another of controlled disintegration since then. In the 80s, you had a somewhat of an economic growth driven by military and defense spending, but LaRouche again characterized this as a bubble. and he forecast almost exactly the 1987 stock market crash. Again, in the 90s, under the Greenspan period, the so-called Clinton economic recovery, LaRouche said it's a bubble. And we saw bubbles pop in 1997, 1998, again the dot-com bubble in 2000. While Greenspan was saying that he does not see irrational exuberance, he doesn't see a bubble, the bubbles popped. And what did they do? They built another bubble, the mortgage-backed security bubble, 2007, 2008. LaRouche again warned in the summer of 2007 that this was going to pop. And he was absolutely right. And he intervened with a proposal, the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, which would have protected homeowners and invested in the physical economy and would have guaranteed no bailout for the speculators. Instead, they went with a bailout. Somewhere in the range of $23 to $27 trillion, bailing out the banks and the financial institutions in the period after the 2008 collapse. This continued through the next decade and then went into high gear again in September 2019 with the so-called repo markets, with $13 trillion in bailouts for the banks in the fourth quarter, or the last quarter of 2019, and another $10 trillion in bailouts since then. And that's what we're living under now, the effects of that. Hyperinflation. You can't shut down physical goods production at the expense of the real economy and pour funny money or fiat currency into the banks without causing inflation, verging toward hyperinflation. At the same time, we have supply chain breakdowns because of the free market, free trade policies. The longer-term danger is food shortages, with millions on the planet already facing starvation, and perhaps 2 to 3 billion more to come if this situation is not reversed. We have energy shortages. So how is the establishment reacting to this? The Great Reset. More power to the central banks. And this is forcing resistance. The Great Reset and the Green New Deal will destroy the potential for nations to develop. Now, two of the leading nations in opposing this are, guess who? Russia and China. And they're allies with the BRICS. They're allies from what used to be called the non-aligned nations, India, Pakistan, Brazil, South Africa, all of which are rejecting this great transition that's underway. Now, the Russian military operations against Ukraine, which we've been covering extensively, were used as an excuse to push ahead this transition. Asset seizures, sanctions, cut off from financial access, designed to destroy the Russian economy, threats against China, threats against all other countries. If you support this, you'll be next. And the imposition in Western Europe and the United States of war economy measures. And we're seeing a reaction to that. There are trucker strikes in France, northern France and Normandy, in Germany and Italy. What are they striking against? High fuel prices and taxes. Fishermen are on strike in Spain and Italy, protesting the unavailability of diesel fuel at affordable prices. On Sunday in Madrid, 150,000 cattle breeders and farmers marched against rising fuel and fertilizer prices and falling farm income. We're facing grain shortages, especially with the natural gas prices going up, which means fertilizer will not be available. The problems with potentially planting in Ukraine and Russia, two of the grain baskets of the world right now, the shutdown of transportation to move food from the fields to the markets and so on. We're seeing oil shortages, energy shortages. There's no credit for exploration because we're trying to transition out of fossil fuels because of the so-called Green New Deal. Bloomberg reported yesterday under the headline, quote, "World's biggest commodity markets are starting to seize up," unquote, meaning no credit to bail out companies involved in nickel and aluminum and other strategic metals that are affected by the inflation. Now, the oil production. Oil consumption is down 9 million barrels per day in the last 2 years, according to the International Energy Agency. And they're forecasting another 3 million barrel per day drop in 2022. They say this is a good thing. It's a move away from fossil fuels. It's also what they call self-sanctioning, or the other term they use is demand destruction. Now, why is this happening? Because people can't afford the fuel. People are driving less. We had the lockdowns, and now we're having the energy shortages. People are eating less. There's an overall austerity. They're flying less, traveling less, and this is considered something good. Now, meanwhile, where is spending up? Military production. They're pouring weapons into Ukraine in a futile attempt to stop the Russian army from carrying out what Putin called enforcing security guarantees for Russia. So spending is up for military production, austerity for consumption and production. Russia and China will not accept it. They won't go along with the Great Reset, and others are looking to Russia and China. So this is going to be a prolonged crisis unless something happens, either nuclear war and total destruction, or a shift to a new strategic and financial architecture. So the question is, which way will Europe and the United States go? Will Germany and France continue to march to the tune hummed by Boris Johnson and the Global Britain fanatics from the City of London? Will the Biden administration and his Tiger team continue to insist on war and austerity? Or will we break out of that? And that's up to you. The Schiller Institute will be holding a conference on April 9th to organize people from around the world. And hopefully many of you will be part of that in Western Europe and the United States, to ensure that we adopt a new strategic and financial architecture based on the economic solutions from Lyndon LaRouche. So I urge you to join our mobilization and become a part of this. Now, I'm going to put 2 links at the description page of today's update. One will be the announcement of the April 9th conference, which you can use to organize. And the second will be a very interesting interview I did yesterday with Algerian National Public Television, where I essentially debated a professor from Kiev on what's actually going on in Ukraine. So I hope you will take some time to look at it. It's very interesting, but we need you to mobilize with us, not just to stop this war and the insanity around war, but to defeat the forces who are pushing the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Thanks for joining me. Get to work, do some organizing, do some critical thinking, and help your friends recognize that the suffering they're moving into now is going to be greatly enhanced unless we break the power of this global oligarchy.